Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Left Hook podcast. I'm James. I'm joined by my co-host, Jordie.
G'day, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
How are you today, mate?
Yeah, good. Yourself?
Very good, thank you. As always, Left Hook Pod, we're here to deliver you guys a strong left hook to counter the mainstream media narrative right cross with some strong independent political commentary and analysis. What's happening this week, Jordie?
It's been an interesting week.
Has it, mate?
Interesting fortnight almost now for news.
Absolutely.
So on today's episode, we're going to be looking at the terror threat level has been raised here in Australia. Mm-hmm. And we'll be looking at the ICC investigating Australian politicians for complicity.
The ICC?
The ICC.
I thought that was only reserved for Africans and the occasional Serb.
No, so they're actually investigating Australian politicians at the moment.
Exciting.
So, yeah, it's very exciting. This is actually an incredible development. And then we will be looking at the unrest in the UK at the moment and how this kind of coincides with what's happening in Australia at the moment.
Yep.
And then we'll be finishing up with some assassinations that have occurred across the Middle East and the ongoing conflicts and tensions. So,
which seems to be an ongoing unfolding story, which we try to give a bit of analysis on every episode.
Yeah. So
mate.
Let's begin. So in Australia at the moment, the terror threat level has been raised from possible to probable amongst fears of community tensions due to the ongoing war and conflict in Gaza.
Goodness.
Yes.
So from what was it, possible to probable?
From possible to probable, yes.
So still not definite?
Still not definite.
Okay, goodness. Yeah. What do you think the motive behind this is?
What, from the government or from the intelligence services?
Or both.
Well, the intelligence services advise the government to raise it. Mm-hmm. So, look, what I'll do is I've got some interesting quotes here.
Yeah.
So the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, said that earlier this week that the terror threat had been raised due to an increase in youth radicalisation, online radicalisation, and the rise of new mixed ideologies.
Interesting.
Interesting, yes. So what I thought was interesting was this quote here, actually, when they're talking about mixed ideologies, was in one particular incident, we have an individual that's latched onto Antifa, which is the American anti-fascist organisation, so an extreme left-wing organisation. But actually in the manifesto, there's neo-Nazi ideologies as well, which he said defied logic.
That does defy logic. So it's like a very confused Antifa member that's definitely not been co-opted by the feds.
No, definitely not. It is interesting to note, though, that a lot of the fascist movements of the 20th century did dress up their ideology and rhetoric with kind of left-wing socialism. They kind of use that to appeal to the working class and dress it up in a more kind of radical revolutionary manner.
Of course.
But obviously pursued very extreme ultranationalist and violent motives.
Yeah,
so,
and anti-worker policies, obviously, anti-union policies.
So when I read that, I was like, okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, and do you think that for example, raising this terror threat level, do you think that has been done to essentially, how can I say, condition the public, for example, to accept maybe other kind of measures that the government might want to put in place using a raised terror threat level as a justification?
So I think there's definitely an element of that.
Yeah.
I think what it comes down to, and look, I'm not going to take any intelligence services in the West on their word. But what they have said, and I think that this is credible, is that there was about 8 instances where they had received information of individuals that were either going to commit an offence or had planned to commit offence, and they said that these individuals had not come under the radar previously, and that these individuals came from a range of different views and ideologies. What they described as being neo-Nazi, religiously motivated, or just kind of your standard lone wolf. Psychopaths.
Yes, of course. Oh,
obviously,
interesting.
So there's a broad spectrum of motivations according to the intelligence agencies, and look, I will take them on face value. You know,
you have to.
It burns me a little bit. But no, you do. So I think there's definitely a raise in extreme right wing ideologies, ultranationalism, neo-Nazi movements in Australia, which we've seen some protests of groups in Australia over the past year. And there's definitely also a rise of what I would consider to be extreme Islamic views, which may be coming from some individuals that are so enraged by what's going on in the Middle East.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, but I guess as well when you kind of give it that blanket term, I guess from that framing, it kind of paints all, say, more politically extreme views under the same brush, for example. So, for example, an anti-genocide, pro-Palestine movement could therefore be painted with the same brush,
of course,
as a neo-Nazi movement, for example, or a protest.
This is what we were going to get into.
Yeah.
So obviously, at the outbreak of the slaughter that's going on in Gaza at the moment, there was huge anti-war demonstrations across Australia. Some of the largest recorded anti-war demonstrations in Australia's history.
Yep.
Even outsizing what happened in Vietnam.
Yep.
So in Adelaide here, we had, it was over 2,000 people easily, probably closer to 3,000 or 4,000. In Victoria, it was several thousand. I've seen numbers that say 10,000. So there was a huge response. And part of that, obviously, was a lot of criticism of Israel. Now, I think what's happened is that a lot of that criticism was taken by Australian politicians and especially by the opposition, by Peter Dutton and the Liberal Party, as being quote-unquote anti-Semitic. So any criticism as being anti-Semitic.
Of course.
The intelligence agencies would have obviously done the same. They would have viewed any criticism whatsoever as a form of extremism. And then what would have happened as well is that as this war is being carried out and you see serious grievances in the Australian community, is that the more overtly Muslim people as well come out and protest and come into the public sphere to speak out against what's going on, is that people with ultra-nationalist ideologies or even neo-Nazis see that and it empowers them and enrages them.
Yeah. So obviously it pushes back to the other side as well.
That's exactly right, correct. And you can imagine that a lot of these right-wing groups saw mass demonstrations right across Australia, Palestinian flags, not just Palestinian flags though, it was a kind of a cross-coalition of different groups.
Yeah.
A lot of them coming from countries within the Middle East, but also here in Australia, and funny enough, the trade unions as well.
Yes, of course.
So these right-wing groups would have seen this and it would have empowered them and enraged them at the same time.
Yeah.
So I think ASIO is picking up on that and seeing the growth in that.
Yeah, well, I guess their job as well is to protect the, shall we say, the status quo.
Of course.
Of course.
That's right.
And any sort of large-scale demonstration that's going to put on political pressure that would potentially threaten the status quo obviously has to be addressed.
Of course.
But I guess, like we said, we can't rule out, I mean, we've been lucky in Australia. We haven't had really any kind of large-scale terror incidents.
Yep.
Obviously, there was the Lindt Cafe siege in Sydney.
Yep.
Probably over a decade ago, I reckon that was.
Yep.
You had like the Port Arthur massacre in the 90s. Both of them, funnily enough, committed by white men. But funnily enough, we haven't had anything kind of major.
No.
And whether that's obviously whether that's because of our intelligence communities doing their jobs and preventing these things, not that we'd know because we never get told about them. Maybe some of the false flag operations they've been planning have just been botched because they've chosen the wrong patsies. So I guess that is an interesting development, and I think it'll be interesting to see where we go from here and how essentially policy and public planning, how the public reacts and how the government also responds and how that reframes their positions going into the future.
That's exactly right. And I would also argue that because of what I would say is Australia's complicity or lack of action of what's going on in Gaza as well, is not only is that enraging certain aspects of the Australian community, and when I say certain aspects, I don't just mean people from the Middle East or Muslims.
No.
I mean your everyday person that has a heart or any sort of moral compass.
Like myself and yourself.
Should be enraged and are enraged from what's going on. Yeah. But also, I'll choose my words carefully here. The influence that a certain country, which is carrying out these atrocities, has over the Australian political establishment. Yep. So Bob Carr, the former New South Wales Premier and Foreign Minister under the Kevin Rudd government, he has just put together a book at the moment which is discussing about Israel's influence and the lobbies that they have here in Australia. Yeah. And so if you are an extreme right-wing group and you see these very real things that are happening, what do you think they're going to perceive that as? They are going to go back and look at that as being a international conspiracy of said state and said ethnic group over Australia's political
over our political sovereignty.
Correct. That's exactly right.
Of course.
Yep. Yeah. So and that's very real, and I think that needs to be put into perspective, which it just isn't.
Yeah, of course, but also not made sure that those same groups, like far-right kind of ethno-nationalist groups, aren't empowered in a reactionary sense from said influence of said Middle Eastern countries.
That's
that are
right.
influencing.
Well, can you imagine if you're one of these extreme right-wing groups and you looked at the speech that Netanyahu gave to American Congress the other week and the 58 standing ovations and the hour-long speech.
I thought he deserved more.
He's
such a good speaker. He deserves 60.
but do you understand how this is empowering these groups?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because, like...
there's going to be such a backlash, I think.
Yeah.
And there's such potential for backlash,
It is,
of course.
but it is. I'm sorry, it's a blatant form of foreign interference.
Yep.
If you have the leader of a country that can come to your parliament or your Congress and address it and get such a rapturous applause by your political class, how else can that really be perceived? And so obviously I don't go down that kind of conspiratorial avenue. I just look at it as that, well, our sovereignty is being violated.
Yeah.
Our political institutions and our politicians are being influenced, and there's a lot of money and a lot of power involved in it.
Of course, which influences our politicians.
Yeah.
And I think Australia's probably never really been a completely sovereign nation. I think every kind of small attempt we've had at sovereignty has been quickly shut down,
of course,
by our imperial overlords. But I guess some are more and less subtle than others. For example, obviously being a British colony, and then now kind of being a US neo-colony. But then, like we said, the influence of like the Israel lobby, which is quite strong. Which I guess plays into the greater kind of international status quo and how our nation and our politics fits into that.
Yeah, that's level. Right. Yeah. And I think Albanese's obviously been trying to play both sides and kind of sit in the middle on the fence and be very cautious, which you can criticise him for. But on the other end of the spectrum, Peter Dutton, the leader of the Liberal Party, some of the language that he's been using from the get-go when these demonstrations began is just so inflammatory and just outright disgusting. Yeah. So the chant that a lot of people used on those demonstrations and an ongoing kind of chant that's used is "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." And I think it's kind of broadly used to say that Palestine will be free from occupation.
Yeah,
not that they're going to like ethnically cleanse the whole state of Israel. It's just it's simply saying that one day the people of Palestine in that area, regardless of your ethnicity, will stop being militarily occupied.
Yeah.
So he compared that chant to the ideology and rhetoric used by a certain leader of Germany during World War II.
Really?
Directly compared it.
That's funny because Israel didn't exist in World War II.
Yeah, I know, but but do you get what I mean?
Of course, yeah.
And so if you are one of these kind of quasi, neo-fascist groups, and you hear the opposition leader saying these things, it's going to empower you. You're going to say, bloody oath it is.
Of course, yeah.
So and what I would just say is that those comments by Peter Dutton were condemned by the I think it's the Australian Jewish Association or the Australian Jewish Council.
Yeah.
They condemned it and said this is not helpful and it's quite offensive to people that died in the Holocaust during World War II.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so he's using these tensions purely for his own political gain.
To inflame his own political narrative.
Yeah, that's right.
I think that's also...
I don't think it's working.
I don't think so. He's not a very charismatic man on the best of days.
No, he's not. He's definitely not. But also, like, just if you're appealing to like very fringe, ultra right wing groups, and that's they're the people that are listening to you and going, yeah, that's some good common sense, Dado.
That is some good common
sense.
Yeah,
I don't think your every standard kind of like politically astute or aware citizen is listening to it and going, you know what, he's making sense.
But then there is again this strange Venn diagram overlap with those people and the ethno-nationalists that would be like the Christian ethno-nationalists that would be, say, for example, threatened by the Jewish conspiracy cabal.
Yeah.
But then you also have this crossover with the ethno-nationalists that mindlessly support Israel.
Yeah.
Both on the extreme right wing.
Yeah,
and as someone,
right.
it's bizarre. It's
that's right.
However, speaking of... I was going to say, speaking of, obviously, condemnation and what's happening there and the rhetoric being used by lots of our politicians.
Yeah, let's go on.
There's actually been essentially a law firm from the New South Wales.
Well, hang on a sec. Before we get into the ICC, we need to bring up... hang on a sec.
Another character,
We need to bring up another character.
Well,
just hang a sec. While we're talking about the terror threat being raised... and what's causing that. Yeah. There was one specific incident by a civil society group and a specific individual that is feeding into this hatred, this Islamophobia, and so I'm sorry I'm laughing. It's just when I read this, I was like, this is just like, you can't really make this
You
things
have to
up.
have a laugh about
Yeah.
it.
So the head of the Australian Anti-Defamation Commission, a man by the name of Dr. Devere Abramovich, sent in a photo to the Victorian radio station 3AW.
3AW. Yeah.
And he...
And this was during his interview as well, I believe.
Yeah, so this is during his interview. He sent in a photo of what he declared to be a Hamas flag being flown in the Fitzroy Gardens here in Victoria, Australia.
Yeah.
So if you look at the flag, it has a green background and Arabic white writing.
Has to be Hamas.
Could not be anything else.
No other
At
option.
first glance, I saw it, I was like, bingo, Hamas.
Hamas, straight
so
up.
It turns
ISIS.
out that this flag is a Shia Muslim flag, which was being flown by a group of people in Melbourne celebrating the day of Ashura, which is a
Shia holiday.
yeah, a Muslim Shia holiday.
Yeah.
So he sent in this photo and declared it to be a Hamas flag that was being flown.
Yeah.
And then he went on to say that this was a declaration of war, quote.
I believe he also said that people were glorifying terrorism.
Yes.
And he also was quoted with saying that Hamas terrorist supporters have hijacked a public space.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is hilarious.
It is. So I'll just say this information that we're sharing at the moment, we got from Michael West Media, so we should disclose that.
Always sterling job done by Michael West Media and their reporters.
Correct. And also it was covered by Paul Barry on the ABC's Media Watch that were just highlighting this blatant piece of misinformation. But these
debunking.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And also we should go in a little bit more into this story, shouldn't we?
This gentleman,
Yes. So you go into this. You've done a bit of research.
So the ADC, which is the Anti-Defamation Commission, which seems to be obviously quite similar to the ADL in the United States.
Yeah.
Obviously pursues these kind of certain political goals. So it's a civil society kind of organisation which is based, founded and based upon combating hate.
I've got their manifesto.
Got their manifesto.
So their manifesto is to ensure a safe and fair society for all Australians of all faiths and cultures by combating, quote, anti-Semitism and all forms of hatred.
I completely agree. That's a really good thing to stand for.
I know, and I totally...
Unironically?
I totally agree. But you would think that they would be able to identify a Muslim flag a little bit easily if this was their job.
Exactly. And funnily enough, obviously, we don't want to defame anyone.
No, of course not.
You don't. And I'm sure, based on their manifesto, that Dr. Devere Abramovich doesn't want to unfairly defame or characterise or incite negative feelings in the public space, which is exactly why he mischaracterised
a flag. And didn't go on his phone and Google the flag and then confirm it. That's
of course. Right, but also, if one was to look on this gentleman's Facebook page, it seems to be, and his social media posting, he seems to be very actively condemning and doxing pro-Palestinian protesters.
Yeah, okay.
So there was an incident where he shared the work location of an activist.
Okay.
Who had the term "All Eyes on Rafah," obviously during the Israeli barbaric assault on Rafah in Gaza. And so he obviously doxed he didn't reveal their name, but doxed their work location, as well as an employee at an Apple store that was wearing a keffiyeh. Obviously doxed the name of their store.
God forbid you wear a scarf.
God forbid you wear a scarf, exactly, especially when it's cold.
Yeah.
And also obviously called pro-Palestine activists at a Labour conference pro-Hamas.
Yeah.
So this just seems to be blatant mischaracterisation.
It is,
which could potentially be defamatory. So I'm still trying to do the mental gymnastics to work my head around his perspective.
Yep.
But lots of his posts also are just kind of condemning pictures of Palestinian flags that other social media users have put up, because obviously just expressing any sort of sympathy or acknowledgement of Palestinian nationalism is an act of severe hatred and worthy of condemnation. So I guess that tells us a little bit about obviously what the organisation, what they say they do, which is fantastic. I think every reasonable person can get behind those motives. But then looking at the views of the founder and what their views are, kind of paints a little bit of a different story. Yeah,
and also in the Michael West Media article, there was some juicy little facts about the funding of the Anti-Defamation Commission.
Correct.
Have you got that up there?
Yes, I do. So look, they've received about $6 million in federal funding
And
from the government.
which government began the funding?
Well, this was the funding was from the Department of Education, Skills and Employment, which
Yeah.
they do, provide.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Grants and funds to these sorts of civil organisations as well. However, it was when our esteemed ex-treasurer Josh Frydenberg was in power in the Morrison government.
Under
and
Scotty.
now he's actually referred to Frydenberg as a friend.
As a close friend.
As a close friend, of course. So they and it's been revealed that the grant process wasn't competitive. There was no selection. It was just essentially like straight up, here's the grant. There was no bidding or anything like that for it. The organisation was essentially handpicked to receive this grant.
Yeah.
So
that came from the Michael West media article.
Yeah. And obviously as well, these kind of grants and stuff, and if you're a non-profit or a civil society organisation, for example, there are certain rules and regulations that you have to follow, for example, so you can't be technically making profit. That's the whole point of a non-for-profit. So according to the Australian Charities and Non-for-Profits Commission, which is who the organisation is registered under, there's also been, so over the last 5 years or so, their total expenditure has been about 2.6 million, which is less than half of the 6 million in income they've received. So the Australian Charities and Non-Profits Commission, when essentially asked about this, revealed that no, we haven't really followed up, and they couldn't comment onto whether there has been any processes to essentially get the excess funding back that this organisation has received, because essentially if you're making in excess of $3 million profit over a certain amount of years, that's not really and doesn't really fit the terms for a non-for-profit. And funnily enough, in that time, there's only been one employee, which has been the chairperson, Abramovich, and they've listed their staff expenses from 2019 to 2021 have risen from $79,000 to $317,000 Australian dollars. And then in 2023, they've gone back to a modest $275,000.
Yeah.
So if you're employing one person, which is the chairperson of the company, they've essentially gotten a pay raise from $79,000 to $317,000. That's a pretty bloody good deal as far as I'm concerned.
That's a good wage.
Yeah,
that's a solid wage.
I think as we've discussed before, maybe a couple times, you and I are both in the wrong business.
Yeah, we are definitely in the wrong business.
We need to start getting, start a civil society organisation just getting.
Hopefully one day I might be able to get into Parliament, and then I could give you a really lucrative contract.
Do you reckon you could do that?
Well, I'll give you a really lucrative contract of fixing air conditioners. Yeah. And then we can register the company in the Cayman Islands. And then we'll get another company to actually come in and do the aircon work, and we'll just blow out the budget. Yeah.
And that's awesome. And obviously you can shut down any inquiry or investigation.
Of course, yeah.
But it's funny because it does, obviously under the Morrison government, one of the things that I think of, apart from, like, one of the main things that comes to mind, apart from just the sheer incompetency, was the amount of, like, handouts and money for
the amount of rorts.
We had like the Watergate scandal where I think Angus Taylor had a company that was registered in the Cayman Islands, funnily enough, and then they received $80 million in funds from the government to buy back water in a kind of a pretty dodgy water buyback scheme that didn't actually exist.
And there was the other cabinet minister that gave a grant to a sporting club in her electorate.
Yes.
I can't remember her name.
There was there was also, I can't remember the exact details, but there was a $400 million grant given to a company that was the location of the business was registered as a beach shack on Kangaroo Island, and they got a $400 million grant. That is a hustle, my friend.
That is a hustle. Of course. So just tying this back into...
However, we need to cut welfare on, like, students.
We do,
students and single mums. Get them out.
Yeah. So I guess we'll just bring this back to, obviously, how this ties...
carried away there.
Yeah, sorry. We'll tie this back into how this ties into the anti-terror threat being raised, is that individuals like this that promote these blatant cases of misinformation, the rhetoric used by the opposition, especially Peter Dutton, are inflaming tensions in Australia.
Yep.
And that, in my opinion, probably was one of the main reasons that led to ASIO advising the government
to increase the terror threat level.
Correct.
So it's almost like a snake eating its own tail.
That's exactly right.
It just keeps snowballing on itself.
It does. Yeah.
And then I guess that leads to whatever objectives politically that any particular party wants to achieve, they're given a lot more leeway to because they have the justification to do so. Yeah.
All right. Shall we move forwards to the next subject?
Absolutely. So, if one person was to, for example, Google the words Australia ICC, the first dozen pages would essentially be exclusive reporting on our cricket team and how our cricket team is faring internationally. With the upcoming cricket matches we have on. However, unfortunately, we're not going to be talking about cricket here.
Okay.
I wanted to breach the subject that has come to light recently, where essentially a charity law firm based in New South Wales has submitted a whole bunch of papers and evidence to the International Criminal Court under the Rome Statute that essentially pertains to the implication of the Australian government in genocide and in war crimes by their complicity in supporting the State of Israel.
Yep.
So it's not just the government. It's specifically Albanese, Penny Wong, but also opposition figures and other kind of senior parliamentarians
that have supported Australia's foreign policy. And
yes,
our stance.
of course. Yep. Now, as referenced earlier, this is absolutely shocking.
This is massive.
Because Anthony Albanese is actually the first Western leader that has essentially been under scrutiny for the ICC under the Rome Statute. Over 100 independent lawyers and barristers have supported these findings. But again, I was shocked because I thought, again, the ICC was made for Africans and Serbs. I didn't know it was made for good, self-respecting white people in Western liberal democracies because we're obviously we're bastions of human rights.
Of course.
They're not crimes when we do it. They're just civilizing missions, of course. But yeah, it's pretty shocking. And I guess when you think about what is happening, because this is obviously ongoing simultaneously while there's an ICJ, the ICJ findings against Israel, which have ruled that they are, plausibly committing genocide. Yeah. But essentially, in our complicity in this comes from the fact that we haven't stopped supporting them.
Yes.
So, for example, it's based this particular kind of finding is based on the freezing of funding to the UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency,
which provides humanitarian aid.
Correct. Which pretty much stopped getting funded by all Western nations a couple months ago
because Israel accused it of having quote unquote affiliations to Hamas, which were completely unfair. They were allegations with no evidence
Maybe
whatsoever.
That's why the threat level was raised in Australia.
Correct. And what I found really upsetting was that Australia just took it at face value.
Exactly.
With no evidence whatsoever, we just cut all of our funding.
And then, as we've talked about previously on the pod, the replacement organisation, World Food Kitchen, went in, and when they were delivering aid, they were deliberately targeted and struck by Israeli airstrikes and drone strikes.
And the Australian citizen Zomi from Victoria, and she was murdered.
She was murdered. She was
assassinated
by the Izzies. Anyways, so it's based on the freezing of funds to UNRWA.
Yep.
Providing military aid and exports to the IDF. Because I think we've provided anti-drone technology as well as I think some mild kind of munitions and that sort of stuff as well.
We allowed Elbit Systems to keep producing weapons that were being sent to Israel.
Of course.
And they were sending money back to their parent company as well.
Yeah, of course. Deploying Australian military personnel to the region. So they have announced that they have deployed military personnel to the region. However, it's been super ambiguous because there's been no disclosure on what the mission is, how many soldiers, the location. So one can assume they're essentially going to be, say, working within the kind of apparatus of Western militaries that are working there as well.
Yeah.
This one's also...
But they don't disclose what they're doing whatsoever.
Exactly. So all we can do is assume, but based on what the information we've been given, that is essentially, obviously, is complicity and support for what they're doing.
Yeah.
This one's pretty messed up, in my opinion, but obviously permitting Australian citizens of dual nationalities, because there's lots of people with dual Israeli and Australian citizenship, permitting them to go over and join the IDF and to fight against the Palestinians and against Hezbollah and join their military campaign that they have going on there. So there are lots of Israelis with Australian citizenship, and lots of them have had experience in the IDF. As an Israeli citizen, there's compulsory military service, which you have to serve in.
Yep.
And that obviously actually kind of draws into complicity a large swathe of their population as part of their military service is being a cog in an occupying force,
Yeah.
which is now currently again committing this horrible genocide and slaughter and exacerbating the tensions in the region. And it's also the government's provided unequivocal support for Israel, the government and the opposition.
Yeah.
Pretty kind of disgusting rhetoric in my opinion, especially with, for example, what Dutto was saying. That kind of support as well. And obviously, the kind of ongoing rhetoric of, well, look, Israel has the right to defend itself, rah, rah, rah. We'll obviously continue showing support.
Yeah.
Despite, obviously, the rhetoric that has also come out by people like Penny Wong saying, oh, look, we want a ceasefire. However, we're still going to be giving them weapons and giving them diplomatic support to continue doing what they're doing. But we do want a ceasefire.
Yeah.
But keep killing, but ceasefire as well for our public. So again, it's playing that both sides politically.
Yeah. So because of all these things, the ICC has deemed that Australia could be complicit.
There's essentially a law firm has gathered a whole bunch of evidence, and they've handed that to the ICC, who are going to be ruling and then making a decision. So it's interesting because no other Western leaders have faced this situation yet.
Which in some ways is unfair because...
Albo's probably the the most moderate out of all of them, which is kind of messed up.
Yeah. Well, I guess it just shows you the power of the United States.
Absolutely.
And how these organisations, like the ICC at The Hague, the United Nations, do not want to go after America.
No, of course, dude. You can't,
plus, also, I think
as we've discussed, the Hague Invasion Act.
Yes, that's right. And I also think they realise that it's not really worth their trouble.
Exactly.
Or I guess here in Australia, we still kind of we respect international law, we'll uphold their findings.
I believe the US aren't signatories to the Rome Statute. No. So they're not technically under that jurisdiction.
But Australia is. And while we're talking about that, and you did mention our great close friend Peter Dutton.
He's a good man.
He did. He's a great man.
What a stellar human.
He is. The other day, he said that if the ICC was to rule that any Australian politicians or individuals were complicit in war crimes, that we would simply just ignore the findings and pull our signature out of the Rome Statute.
Classic Dutto. That's hilarious.
It is,
Yeah. Because there's no teeth to international law.
No, there's not.
Unless
there's
if you choose to accept it, unless you're going after an African warlord or a Slobodan Milosevic character, where you have the backing of the US or a Putin-type character.
Yeah, but what I want to say is that we supported the ICC's condemnation of Vladimir Putin in Ukraine, after that, because obviously the ICC put out a arrest warrant for Putin, obtaining to his war in the Ukraine. So we obviously recognised that, supported it, but in the moment it comes back to Australia and an Australian politician could be found guilty.
Nah, don't want to touch that, mate.
And also it really rips the mask off, especially the Liberal Party and Peter Dutton's facade of, we're a liberal democracy, we uphold, international law, humanitarian rights, but the moment that we actually have to...
be held accountable.
Yeah,
be held
accountable to said institutions and findings. The mask just comes straight off.
Especially with like a Dutton-like character who kind of really runs on that law and order, security.
Yeah, that's right.
That's his whole kind of his political rhetoric.
That's right.
Hilarious.
And funny enough, what Penny Wong said in response to this to Peter Dutton, she said that no, we should take the ICC seriously.
Absolutely.
And stay as a signature to the Rome Statute because we can use the ICC to confront China over what's going on in the South China Sea and their humanitarian rights issues.
Of course. So again, double standards. One rule for thee and not for me, essentially. Yeah. But it is an interesting development, and it's going to be interesting, I think, to see whether other countries... for example, the UK, obviously maybe people in the US, but other, especially European nations as well, whether, some of their more humanity-minded kind of lawyers and activists kind of rally together and start doing similar things, because that will change the dynamic of, again, eventually... It will change the dynamic of how the ICC is viewed in the international community as well.
So, what you just mentioned the United Kingdom, and we probably should address the elephant in the room. We've talked about tensions, civil unrest and tensions in Australia. We should probably address the elephant in the room.
Has there been civil unrest in the United Kingdom?
I saw something.
Something about it.
Something about civil unrest.
Goodness gracious. Yeah. I thought they were a civilised, polite society.
Yeah, they are.
Apparently not.
So, all right. So
to our audience as well, we discuss a lot of messed up things, but we have to be able to inject a little bit of brevity and
Yeah.
a little bit of humour into it. Otherwise, the sheer weight of the horrors that are happening in the world at the moment will drive any human being
Of course.
to
Yeah.
depression and suicide.
Okay,
so let's have a laugh.
Okay, so if people have been paying attention to the news or their social media, they may have seen that there are
Riots.
riots. Like yes. Let's describe. Let's describe
un-British behaviour.
Very un-British, uncouth British behaviour. Yeah. So there was major, riots.
Protests.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Yeah.
Pogroms as well.
Pogroms, yeah.
So
Course.
there was several incidences across the United Kingdom. Most of them were quite violent. There were some that weren't. I should say that there were like pockets of what I would consider to be legitimate
peaceful right-wing reactionaries.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
Yes. So there were serious riots and civil unrest inside the United Kingdom. There were pogroms. There were groups of what I would consider to be very disconnected, uneducated rabble, which in Australia we call bogans, throwing bricks and petrol bombs at mosques,
torching stores,
police cars.
I saw videos of them raiding a Greggs.
Yeah,
getting some chips or something.
Trying to apprehend people of any ethnic minority that weren't overtly British.
Yep.
They were trying to pull them out of cars, threatening to punch them and bash them.
Yeah.
It was
pretty horrible.
It was horrible. It was very shocking to see. And so this was in response to a stabbing or a murder of 3 children at a
like a dance school or
it was
something
a Taylor Swift dance school where 3 children were murdered and straight away
which is disgusting.
Which is obviously horrible. And on social media there was the false narrative spread that the man responsible was a Muslim refugee that had just come off a boat. And it turns out that no, he was a Welsh British man who was Christian.
Was a Christian.
Yeah,
Goodness, God forbid.
Yeah, and so this was spread by the great intellectual giants of Andrew Tate and our tech overlord Elon Musk that tuned onto this and just spread this as being factual.
Yep.
And as you can imagine, the way, as this was remediated across the internet in all different forms, people just took it at face value.
Of course, yeah.
And when that was also spread, it then promoted more riots across the United Kingdom.
Yep.
There was other groups though that responded to this in a more peaceful manner. I did see some kind of what I consider to be nationalist right-wing groups that were going out in the street, very small groups, saying that obviously immigration's a problem, but the vast majority of it were violent reactionary mobs just destroying stuff on the streets.
As Marx would say, the lumpen proletariat.
The lumpen proletariat.
Yes,
these are people,
the unwashed masses, essentially. Yeah.
No, but you got to understand, these are people that are very, in my opinion, disconnected from society, from politics, from the news media. That I don't think they've probably had incredible educations. They are enraged. And what I'd just say is that the rage that these people are feeling, it's misguided. But it's legitimate rage. These people live in areas that have deindustrialized. There are no public services. They are living in terrible housing conditions. And so when they see things on their social media about immigrants, like this, for example, obviously this was not real.
Done by an immigrant, of course.
Quote unquote, done by an immigrant. They see these things on social media, and what is their response? Is to
blame the other.
Yeah, but also to go out in the street and loot and pillage because they have serious rage built up inside them because they've been abandoned by their country.
Yeah,
they have been.
By the political class.
That's a matter of fact.
Yeah.
And we mentioned this previously on a podcast about just the decline of trade unionism and actual working class movements, not just in Australia, but in America and the United Kingdom. So these people are just completely abandoned by society. They're not class conscious.
No.
They're not part of any sort of political movements that can educate them and make them aware of what's actually going on. And for them to understand that your enemy is not the refugee coming across in a boat. It is the wealthy billionaire Elon Musk that's flying into your country on a private jet and then stoking these fears to get you to go out and cause these kinds of unrest.
Absolutely, yeah. And that obviously I think feeds into kind of the broader agendas of the political establishment. And this actually ties back to what we were talking about earlier, because then that way Obviously, the destruction and large-scale looting and rampaging and violence is horrible.
Yes.
But then that way, the security establishment can say, well, look, for example, we can't have these right-wing fascist mobs, so we're going to bring in new kind of authoritarian policing powers that will allow us to shut these down.
Yeah.
But then, again, that's going to feather them or tar the left-wing, say, for example, pro-Palestine, anti-Israel activists with the same brush as these right-wing reactionaries.
Of course.
So I think it does feed into the overall objectives of the political class and enforcing the status quo, especially as a direct consequences of their actions, we're going to see the further and further impoverishment of the lower classes.
That's right.
Like you were saying, all public resources, benefits, economic opportunities get stripped away. And that essentially gives the political leeway to be able to shut down any kind of reactions that may arise publicly from that sort of stuff.
Why you mention that, I think this really highlights the way that the United Kingdom, their economy and their political system has just, ever since Tony Blair has just fallen into a state of decay. And what I'd say is that
I think they're still the sixth biggest economy in the world on GDP.
Yeah, but
there's such a wealth discrepancy.
There is, but I've also read that they're going to slip past 10th in the next coming years. Loki mentioned that. He said that they were the fifth or sixth largest economy, and some statistics show that they're going to be like 10th or 11th in the next coming decade.
I shouldn't be smiling, but how hilarious it would be if we overtook them.
It would be quite funny. It'd be quite ironic. But what I'd just say is, while we're talking about this, is that Australia has done multiculturalism, in my opinion. People may disagree with this. I think we've done it very effectively, starting with Malcolm Fraser, going Paul Keating, not so much John Howard. But what I say is, over the past 30 years, we've done a really good job of being able to incorporate different ethnic groups and cultures into Australia, where it's become quite homogenous, where you go to school with people of all different religions, ethnic backgrounds, and we don't kind of have those ethnic and cultural divisions in Australia.
Of course,
But I would argue that's also because we've had, these are slipping now, but we have had, and still do to a degree, really good public services to support people like this. We do still have a decent level of education. Once again, this is slipping. If you look at the OECD standards, Australia's education and healthcare is slipping, but they are relatively good, and that has allowed multiculturalism, in my opinion, to flourish quite well in Australia. Where if you look at the United Kingdom, that has not happened. That has not happened. There's always been real divisions ethnically and religiously there. They have had a lot of immigration over the past few years. And unfortunately, a lot of those people have not been able to be incorporated into assimilated into society.
But of course, I think, like coming back to what you were saying earlier, I think the root of these problems are the socio-economic problems.
That's right.
It's not a religious or a cultural difference.
No, of course not.
Because if everyone has enough money and is supported, has enough support and opportunities for themselves and their future and vague financial stability, then people don't resort to these kind of reactionary positions and look for someone to blame.
That's right. I was just kind of trying to point out the fact that multiculturalism here in Australia has been done very effectively. But as the United Kingdom slips into a state of decay, these tensions and divisions are only going to grow.
Of course, and that's something that I think will be dangerous because that'll affect the rest of the English-speaking world.
While we're talking about this, I found this really fascinating. So Tariq Ali is a British Pakistani writer, historian, and I've been reading one of his books at the moment on Churchill. And I was reading this specific excerpt the other evening as the riots were going on, and I read it and I was like, this is just really incredible. So I thought I'd just share this. And it's talking about the occupation in France during World War II when the Germans occupied France, and he was talking about the French resistance, and he was talking about who was actually resisting occupation. I was talking about the different resistance groups, and he noted here that the majority of the resistance was non-French in ethnic terms. The underground included Spanish refugees that came from the Franco-fascist Spanish and the anti-fascist Italians. There was Armenians, Arabs, Jews, and others who in total outnumbered the native French. I just found that really fascinating, that when the French were occupied, it was these ethnic groups
That made up the bulk of the resistance.
That made up the bulk of the resistance.
That is interesting.
Found that very fascinating.
And then obviously that implies the complicity of the native French population in the occupation.
Yes. That's exactly right.
Well, that's some food for thought.
It is. Very interesting. All right. Well, let's
move on to our last topic.
Yeah, let's do it.
Circling it back to recent events that are unfolding in the Middle East at the moment, we've had a spate of assassinations recently undertaken by Israel. So this essentially included the assassination of the Hamas political leader and a Hezbollah commander. So this is quite interesting, of course, because the political leader of Hamas, his name was Ismail Haniyeh, and he was actually in Tehran at the time of the assassination.
The capital city of
Iran. So he was there, obviously, for the inauguration of their new president, whose name eludes me at the moment. And he was assassinated, and this is obviously quite a big diplomatic shake-up, because not only was it an assassination of Haniyeh, who was quite moderate in terms of Hamas terms. He
was a Hamas politician and leader of their Politburo.
Yes, correct. And he's been quite vocal in terms of ceasefire and negotiations. So I think this actually kind of disproves the ongoing Israeli rhetoric that we want a ceasefire and we want negotiations, because they just assassinated their lead negotiator. Right? Not only that, but that happened in Tehran. So the Iranians obviously view this as an assault on their sovereignty, because it is a direct strike on Iranian soil. And secondarily, the Hezbollah commander, his name was Fuad Shukr, and he was assassinated in Beirut. I believe they bombed like a residential apartment building, which killed him. It also killed 3 other people, 2 of them children, and injured about 74 more. So again, in terms of wanting diplomacy and negotiations, let's bomb residential areas. That's the classic kind of MO.
Assassinate people in other countries.
Of course, yes. With civilian life just completely disregarded. So the funny thing about this is the Israelis have claimed that this is a response to an attack on what happened, I think, about 2 weeks ago, where there was essentially an explosion in Majd al-Shams, which is a occupied area in the Syrian Golan Heights, which has been occupied by Israel since 1973. So not as many people know this, but not only have they occupied Palestine, they've also occupied a part of Syria. And the Golan Heights it's a more of a high altitude position, and it's strategically quite important from like a military point of view, but it also has resources, primarily water. So that was kind of the primary water resource for Syria. That's been occupied by Israel, of course. And the population that live there are all Syrians. They consider themselves Syrians, and they have been occupied by Israel. So what happened is there were 12, again, completely horrible, but 12 children were killed when an explosion struck a football pitch. So there hasn't really been any accountability for this, because Israel straight away condemned this and said, oh, this was a Hezbollah strike, which is funny, again, while they're, trying to starve out children and bombing refugee camps anyway, because they're obviously feigning so much outrage at the death of these children. Hezbollah have come out and said, of course, we didn't do this. That's absurd. That's outrageous. So it's still speculated. Some people believe it was an Iron Dome battery, like a missile that went off track, off course, and landed here. Other people have speculated that this was an actual false flag Israeli strike, which wouldn't be the first time. So in trying to obviously gin up some political support for this, Israeli leaders actually went into the Golan Heights and tried to get a photo op with this community. And they were all heckled, and all the members of this community who are mourning their slaughtered children told the Israelis to to get out. Essentially, we don't want you here. They don't consider themselves Israeli; they consider themselves Syrian. They consider themselves under occupation, and I'd imagine the vast majority of them would be against the current actions of the Israeli government. So it's interesting as well, because despite all the rhetoric that we hear about Iran being such a threat to Israel, Iran has only actually struck Israeli soil once before, and that was earlier on in this year. I believe it was in April. So that was as a retaliation to Israel bombing an Iranian embassy in Damascus. And as a retaliation, Iran, I think they announced about 2 days in advance, they said, we're going to be retaliating. We're going to send a whole bunch of missiles into Israel, which obviously if you want to retaliate and do damage, you wouldn't typically announce it beforehand.
Yeah.
So they sent a whole lot of munitions, batteries, missiles over, which were then shot down by the Iron Dome. Iran then proceeded to say, oh, well, look, this matter's closed from here on out.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, that was perceived as many as like an intelligence gathering operation because it also cost the US taxpayer,
Yes.
$4 billion that's estimated to shoot down all these munitions. And that's in, obviously, the operation of the Iron Dome, all their munitions that they need to use to counteract the incoming strike.
Yep.
It's estimated to cost them about $4 billion, so again, puts more economic strain on the Israeli state. And also it's intelligence gathering because it allows the Iranians and the Yemenis and all the other resistance groups in the area to see in real time and monitor the reaction and how the Iron Dome reacts, for example, and how their defense systems work, where things are located, etc. So despite... so obviously, despite, Israel going, frequently assassinating Iranian nuclear scientists, bombing embassies, assassinating political leaders in Iran, then Iran still has only on one time previously struck Israeli soil, which is what happened earlier this year. So the Iranians have essentially vowed that, look, there is going to be retaliation. Hezbollah has also vowed retaliation as well.
And we're still waiting for
said
retaliation.
And I think it shows a difference in kind of perspective and military doctrine.
And temperament.
And temperament, of course, because I think obviously the Iranians are aware that they have to manage the escalation.
Yeah.
And I think the main point of this is to escalate it to a point where the United States has to get involved.
Yeah.
Which they've said they don't really want to go to war with Iran. They said China's the big fish.
Yeah.
We don't really want to go into a war with Iran, especially because they have escalatory dominance in the area. They'll pretty much shut down 40+% of the world's oil supply, cripple the global economy. So the cards are in their hands, and it's not tactically a very smart move, I don't think. Right. And I think, like I said, it shows a difference in temperament because the Iranians and the Lebanese and the Syrians and the various Iraqi resistance groups in the area, they can sit there and bide their time and let the Israelis and the United States and the allied forces, probably some Aussies over there as well, just essentially sweat it out.
Yeah.
And that obviously...
They can play the long game.
They can play the long game, essentially, because they have been there beforehand for longer and they will be there for longer in the long run.
And I think it shows the way now that Israel has been pushed... Well, it hasn't been pushed, should I say.
They've pushed themselves.
They've pushed themselves. They've chosen to basically be stuck in a permanent state of war now.
Yeah.
Where obviously there is the ongoing slaughter in Gaza and the occupation of the West Bank, but now they are lashing out on multiple fronts now. Obviously there's what's going on in Iran now and with Hezbollah in Lebanon, and they are basically pursuing a suicidal militaristic foreign policy.
In my opinion as well, yes.
Yeah.
But also as well, their country is on a civil society level, it's fracturing internally as well.
There's lots of unrest, huge demonstrations against Netanyahu. There's also another
interesting development, which I found pretty sickening, and I do apologise to our audience, because this is a pretty sensitive topic. There's recently been revelations that Israeli soldiers have been sexually abusing and sodomizing Palestinian prisoners, specifically males, inside military prisons in Israel.
And this was an internal investigation.
Yes, so a bunch of soldiers got essentially detained by a military court.
Yeah.
Obviously, because evidence came out. It's actually footage that can be watched online. It's absolutely despicable.
Yeah.
And funnily enough, when this first happened, a whole bunch of insane Zionist kind of settlers and military personnel surrounded the courthouse and demanded that the soldiers be released and not be prosecuted for using rape as a weapon of torture.
Yeah.
How insane is that?
It is.
What other society would this be acceptable politically? It absolutely would not be. Yet this is ongoing.
Yeah.
And we've seen from then on Israeli talk shows and stuff, you've seen the talking heads and the pundits discussing how, well, no, this is actually justified what they're doing, and this should be part of our military doctrine.
Yeah.
This is also coming from the same kind of political unit that condemned, with no actual specific evidence, the mass sexual assault committed by Hamas on October 7th, which we haven't actually seen any evidence for. There are a few debunked kind of articles that came out in the Western press, which were then debunked by other members of the Israeli press and independent news outlets. But then these same people, when did you ever think you would see a pro-rape protest?
No,
it boggles the mind.
It does.
And I think as well, this plays into the wider geopolitical aspect because the surrounding nations, the axis of resistance in the Middle East, they know that the longer they go on, the more the society is just going to tear itself apart.
Of course.
And it's really quite sickening. Like we had, I've never been able to imagine this before. I've never thought I'd, because the main thing that Bibi Nunu, the omnipotent, claims is, well, we're the only country in the Middle East that has
liberal democracy.
Liberal democracy. In Iran, they make these ridiculous claims about hanging gays from cranes, for example,
and how gays from the cranes of
Tehran.
and
and how there's no women's rights. Yet at the same time, we have these extreme acts of deprivation, which is sanctioned and endorsed by a wide chunk of society.
That's right. And I'll just add that this really hasn't been kind of deeply analysed in Western media and Australian media whatsoever.
It hasn't been touched.
Yes, but when the initial allegations of mass sexual assault by Hamas came out, it was front pages, New York Times, the Australian,
and they fucking ran with it.
They did.
You even had, for example, the finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, him and Ben-Gvir, who's the minister of head of the Ministry for Interior, which is like the kind of domestic security kind of ministry. They're both kind of the more insane right-wing elements of Netanyahu's coalition. But Smotrich came out the other day in a speech and he was lamenting the fact that the world and the pressure put on them by the international community would not allow them to starve 2 million people, even though, and he said this, it is moral and justified to do so. Yeah. This is wild, man.
It's wild.
This is insane.
It's absolutely wild.
And I guess, you know what? But then if our government, going back to what we were talking about earlier, is complicit in supporting this government, then then we're equally as culpable, in my opinion. Because the pressure hasn't obviously been put on enough because these people still think they can get away with doing it.
Yeah.
And unfortunately the thing is, though, that it's only going to continue escalating because they need the escalation to keep their political position stable and to further it. So it doesn't bode well for the future of what's going to be happening in the near distant future in the region.
And as we keep supporting these actions and we pursue a foreign policy that is not critical of Israel and highly supportive of America and their global imperial dominance, is that we're going to have that kickback. We're going to have more tensions here in Australia, like we were discussing earlier, because the more we endorse these things, the more we pursue things like this, the more people are going to be pissed off.
Absolutely, and it also kind of puts this fracture in the international community because the rest of the world that isn't a white Anglo kind of settled nation are going to be looking at this.
It isn't subordinated by the US.
Yeah, and they're going to look at us and say, you guys are absolutely insane.
Yeah,
and then
absolutely.
Obviously when it comes to, for example, what while we're supporting this, what right do we have to say anything and condemn China for human rights abuses and Russia for human rights abuses? Not that there aren't any there, but we don't have any leg to stand on.
No, we have no moral ground whatsoever.
No moral ground. Yeah. And honestly, I found it really disturbing.
Yeah, it is.
It's very
exactly right. All right, well, we should probably wrap this up.
On that happy note, we're going to wrap it up for the week.
So this is our weekly pod finished. Yep. We do have a
very special guest.
We do. We're doing an interview with someone.
Yeah.
After this, which will be uploaded shortly.
Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for all the support, and we'll see you guys next time.
Catch us later. Thanks. Peace. Bye.